And I'm joined now by Mark Weiss. He's the Director of International Operations at Reagan AeroTech, a Beijing-based aviation consulting firm. Mark, you've been in the cockpit a million times, never gone through an experience like this, but is this your worst nightmare when you're piloting a plane, something like this happening?
You know, it's not really my worst nightmare because you never think about this happening. I mean, windows can crack, and that's not that uncommon. But to have one totally be blown out, that's practically unheard of. It really is.
And boom, you've got to react quickly. You've got a co-pilot who's almost being forced out of the plane. What goes through the mind of a pilot during that situation? And obviously, heroic action to get the plane back on the ground.
Well, you know, we think of it as heroic action. Certainly it is. And certainly don't want to take away from the actions of that crew. But, you know, it's a practiced event when you have a rapid depressurization. But certainly when you sit and see that your co-pilot is being sucked out the window, it does make your adrenaline go a little faster.
Give me a sense. You're in the cockpit. What happens when something like this happens? I mean, it has to be very quick. Just describe, obviously you trained for this, so what actually happens?
Well, it's instantaneous. It just goes like that, and you do train for it. We call them high dives, depressurization. And so what you're going to do, the first thing you want to do is you have to recognize, and what we're trained for, is that the lack of oxygen. So you must put your oxygen mask on, and the newer aircraft all have goggles in them, so you have something that you could see your instrumentation, plus you're breathing 100% oxygen at that time. And then you start going through procedure. When you have something, if you're not quite sure where it happened or what happened, you've got to make sure that the structural integrity of the aircraft is not compromised by the maneuvers you may do. But when you see something like that, obviously you're going to try and get the airplane out of what they call hostile air, so you can be down at a habitable altitude so that the passengers in the airplane can breathe. It certainly speaks to the fact that people should have their seatbelts on at all times, which is what we do in the cockpit. And that crew practiced what they were trained to do. And, you know, people should recognize that when they buy a ticket on an airplane, on a reputable airline, it's not just to get from A to B, but it's for the training the pilots and the flight attendants go through all the time.
Mark, this comes on the heels of the Southwest Airlines incident, which it's remarkable. I don't remember ever talking to a pilot about this on the air. We're talking about two incidents. Coincidence?
Yeah, but you remember that the Southwest flight was very different. The Airbus 319 had the cockpit window come out. The 737 from Southwest actually had a fan blade from the interior of the disc had structural failure, and that came through the cowling and then pierced the window and broke the window. So a similar outcome. Unfortunately, the woman passed away because of that, but not quite the same scenario for events.
Mm-hmm. You know, you mentioned this. I'm holding this script up here. This is really about the size of a window. If you're a passenger and that force is sucking you in that direction, it's incredible to imagine somebody, and imagine that force pulling on a body. I can't imagine what it was like to be in that plane at that time. I mean,
you know, you really can't put yourself in that type of a position because I think human beings don't want to think of somebody going out a window the size of what we just mentioned. But that's exactly what happens. You're sucked out of that. That's why it's so important to make sure that you're strapped in and to make sure that you put your oxygen mask on as quickly as possible.
What about aging planes? I mean, what's the takeaway? Should we be concerned at all if we're flying, or is this just an incident that happened?
You know what? Aging airplanes are not uncommon throughout the world, as long as they're maintained properly. When you talk about aging airplanes, airplanes periodically get literally torn apart and then put back together with new parts. So the age of an airplane is not necessarily what you're really flying on. You're going to have new parts, almost like a person. Yeah. In many cases.
I need some new parts, I'm sure. Mark, thanks so much for coming in. Appreciate it.